Lena had worked at the restaurant for almost a year, yet every morning when she stepped through the glass doors, she felt the same nervous flutter in her chest. The place was far from ordinary. Everything inside looked polished and expensive, from the marble counters to the gold-trimmed light fixtures. Even the smell in the air felt costly. Guests came dressed in clothes she had only seen in magazines. And in the far corner of the dining hall, resting under soft lights, stood a grand piano that seemed more like a piece of art than an instrument. She never touched it. She only looked at it when no one was paying attention. The smooth black surface and the elegant curves reminded her of a life she once had, a life she tried not to think about during her long shifts. But sometimes, when she walked past it, her fingers twitched with the memory of how the keys used to feel under her hands. The owner, Mr. Calder, didn't miss much. He had sharp eyes, the kind that moved quickly and judged quickly. He walked around the restaurant every now and then, checking on his staff, making sure everything looked perfect. He liked order, and he liked money, and he liked to feel like he controlled the room. Most employees tried to stay out of his way, unless they had to speak to him. Lena preferred quiet. She rarely talked unless necessary. Her coworkers knew she was kind, and she always helped out without complaint, but she was private. She never told anyone why she sometimes paused at the piano. She never explained why her eyes softened when she looked at it, or why her shoulders became tense afterward. Her days were full of carrying trays, cleaning tables, and managing polite smiles. She worked fast and tried not to make mistakes, because one wrong move could cost her the job she depended on. Her mother's medical bills had drained everything she once had. The long hours, the tired feet, the stress, it was all worth it if she could keep the house running and her mother cared for. One afternoon, the restaurant was unusually quiet. A few early guests sat near the windows, their soft conversations blending with the clinking of glasses. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, spreading warm patterns across the floor. During a short break, Lena walked past the piano, like she always did. This time, her steps slowed. She looked around and didn't see anyone paying attention. Her heart beat faster for reasons she didn't want to admit. She stepped closer and let her hand drift over the top of the piano. Her fingertips traced the edge gently. Then, without thinking too much, she pressed down one key. The note was soft, barely a whisper, but it reached her ears like a memory she had been trying to bury. She closed her eyes for a second, just a second. One note shouldn't hurt, she told herself. One note shouldn't bring back everything she had walked away from. But before she could step back, a voice cut through the air. Well, well, so you finally decided to play something? Her breath caught. She turned and saw Mr. Calder standing a few feet away. His arms were crossed, and his expression held a mix of amusement and irritation. I wasn't playing, she said quietly, pulling her hand away from the keys. You were touching it, he replied, raising an eyebrow. Same thing. Lena froze. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't supposed to touch the piano at all. It was only there for decoration, as far as she knew, or maybe for the occasional hired performer, but never for a waitress in a simple uniform. Calder stepped closer, his shoes clicking sharply on the floor. You know that piano cost more than most people make in a year, right? He said. What were you planning to do with it? She shook her head. Nothing. I'm sorry. You just what? He asked, studying her as if she were a puzzle he didn't care to solve. I just stopped for a moment, she said. It won't happen again. He smirked. Good. We wouldn't want guests thinking the staff can treat this place like a music school. Lena nodded quickly and stepped back. She kept her eyes down, hoping he would walk away. For a moment, she thought the situation was over, but Calder wasn't done. You know, he said slowly, glancing at the few guests scattered across the room. "This place has been feeling a bit dull lately. People come in, they eat, they talk, and they leave. Nothing special." She didn't understand why he was telling her this, so she stayed quiet. "Maybe we need a little entertainment," he continued with a shrug. "Something different, something unexpected." Lena's stomach tightened. She didn't like where his tone was going. He looked at her again, his eyes sharp. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you know how to play?" Her breath trembled. "No," she lied quickly. He chuckled, not believing her for a second. "Then why touch the keys like you missed them?" She had no answer. Her silence gave him all the confidence he needed. Dot Calder tapped the top of the piano with his finger. "How about this?" he said. "If you're so drawn to it, why don't you give us a little show?" Her heart dropped. "Sir, I really can't. I'm working." "You're on break," he reminded her. "And I'm the owner. If I say it's fine, it's fine." "I don't think I should," she said softly. Her hands curling at her sides, his voice grew colder. "Are you refusing a simple request?" She swallowed hard. She had seen him fire someone for less. The memory still frightened her. "No, sir," she whispered. "Good," he said with a dismissive wave. "Sit, play something. Anything. It doesn't even have to be good." Lena looked around the restaurant. A couple near the window had turned to watch. A man who had been reading a newspaper lowered it slightly, clearly waiting to see what would happen. Even the bartender leaned forward with interest. Her face grew warm with embarrassment. She walked slowly to the bench. Every step felt heavy, like she was walking toward a cliff. When she sat down, the piano felt too large, too loud, too important. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment, trying to steady herself. She hadn't played in almost 3 years. Back then, the piano had been her world. She practiced for hours daily, dreaming of performing somewhere big. But life didn't wait for dreams. When her mother became ill and bills piled up, she had no choice but to let music go. The piano she once owned was sold. Her lessons stopped. Her life changed overnight. Now, sitting here again, surrounded by strangers waiting for her to embarrass herself, she felt small. Her fingers twitched with forgotten muscle memory, but her heart clenched with fear. Calder stood a few feet away, watching with clear expectation. "Go on," he said. "Just a simple tune. Don't make it dramatic." She didn't answer. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers gently on the keys. They felt cold at first, unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. She pressed down a key, just one. The note echoed softly across the room. Someone chuckled under their breath, probably assuming she had no idea what she was doing. Lena felt the pressure build in her chest. The room wasn't loud, but it felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that made it hard to breathe. She pressed another note, then another. Her hands shook slightly. She wasn't playing yet. Not really. She was testing the keys, testing herself. A memory flashed through her mind, a quiet afternoon from years ago, sitting beside her old piano teacher, learning how to express emotion through sound. She remembered how music used to feel, like a second heartbeat, like something alive. For a moment, she forgot the room watching her. She forgot Calder's smirk. She forgot the pressure of her job. She only felt the keys beneath her fingertips. But with the weight of so many eyes on her, she didn't know if she could bring herself to play more than those hesitant notes. She glanced up briefly and saw curiosity in some faces, but judgment in others. It made her shrink back emotionally, unsure of what to do. Her throat tightened. She wanted to stand up and walk away, to apologize and return to work, but she couldn't. Calder wouldn't let this go. He wanted to see her fail, or at least be entertained by her struggle. She pressed another note, softer this time. The sound floated into the air, gentle and fragile. Her fingers curled slightly, her mind battling between fear and the instinct she had buried for years. The room waited. Dot and Lina, sitting alone at the grand piano, felt the world hold its breath around her as she tried to find the courage to touch the music she had left behind. Lina sat frozen at the piano, her fingers resting gently on the keys, while the restaurant around her slowly shifted its attention toward her. She didn't know how long she sat like that, caught between the pressure of the moment and the fear sitting heavily in her chest. What she did know was that every second felt loud, even though no one was speaking. The sound of chairs moving, glasses clinking, and soft murmurs all blended into a dull background hum. For a moment, she thought maybe Mr. Calder would lose interest and walk away. Maybe he would decide this little scene wasn't worth his time. But when she glanced up, he was still standing there with his arms crossed, watching her with a mix of curiosity and impatience. He wanted to see her do something. Anything got, and the guests wanted a show. Lina took a quiet breath and tried to calm her heartbeat. She reminded herself that it was just a piano, just an instrument, something she had once loved, something that had once felt like home, but now it felt foreign, heavy, like a test she wasn't ready for. She pressed one more note, this time slightly louder. It rang through the open space, reaching even the guests seated farthest from her. A few people paused mid-conversation to look toward the sound. It was subtle, but she saw it the shift in their attention. Her hands trembled as memories tugged at her. She remembered sitting in a small room years ago, practicing scales until her knuckles hurt. She remembered her mother listening from the kitchen, smiling softly each time Lina played her favorite tune. She remembered the feeling of belonging, but those memories only made the present moment harder. Because now, she was just a waitress in a busy restaurant, trying not to make a fool of herself. She wanted to get up. She wanted to say she couldn't do it, that she had forgotten everything. But Calder leaned forward slightly, giving her a look that said backing out was not an option. She blinked and steadied her breathing. If she was going to do this, she needed to focus. She couldn't think about the pressure. She couldn't think about the people staring. She couldn't think about how she might lose her job if she disappointed the wrong person. Her fingers touched the keys again, hesitant but determined. Then she began to play Dot at first. The notes came slowly. She stitched them together, like someone remembering how to walk after years of sitting still. A simple pattern, nothing complex. Something she had learned as a child. Her hands moved carefully, each note spaced out as she tried to find the rhythm buried deep inside her. A couple sitting nearby exchanged looks. They seemed surprised. Not impressed, yet just surprised that she wasn't entirely hopeless. Lina felt a spark, a tiny one, but enough to keep her going. She took another breath and let her fingers move a little more freely. The melody formed slowly, like a quiet stream finding its path through stones, but she could still feel the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in her fingers. She wasn't playing the way she used to. She wasn't letting the music guide her. She was just trying not to disappoint anyone. Louder, Calder said from behind her. Dot. His voice startled her mid-note. She pressed the next key too hard, and the sound clashed awkwardly with the melody. A couple of guests winced. Heat rushed to her cheeks. "Sorry," she whispered, as if apologizing to the piano. Calder sighed, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Come on, you're barely touching it. Play properly, if you can." His tone stung. She knew he wasn't trying to motivate her. He wanted to see what would happen if he pushed. Maybe he expected her to break, to stand up and walk away embarrassed. Maybe that would give him something to talk about later. Lina swallowed hard and kept playing. She tried again, this time pressing with more confidence. The melody grew stronger, slightly fuller. A few heads lifted in her direction. Some listened with mild interest. Others watched because they were curious how long she would last. Her hands still felt stiff, but the sound was improving. A man at a table in the corner whispered something to his partner and nodded toward the piano. She didn't know if they were encouraging or judging. She didn't want to know. The weight of their attention made her chest tighten again. She could feel doubt creeping in. What if she made a mistake? What if she forgot the next part? What if she froze? Her fingers stumbled briefly, and she stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the music. Is that all? Calder asked. Lena closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't want to quit. She had come this far. She had touched the keys again after 3 long years. Walking away now would feel like losing something important. She placed her hands back on the keys, forcing herself not to look at anyone. Not Calder. Not the guests. Not even the reflections in the polished floor. Just the keys. Slowly, she began again. The soft melody returned. She let the familiar pattern guide her, letting each note connect to the next without thinking too much. The more she focused on the music, the more the restaurant around her faded into the background. Her hands moved with a little more certainty now, as if something inside her had loosened. She didn't feel like the old version of herself. Not yet, but she could feel traces of that girl again. The one who believed in dreams. The guests noticed the change, too. Their murmurs quieted slightly. The couple near the window leaned forward. Even the bartender paused in the middle of cleaning a glass. Calder watched with narrowed eyes. He didn't look impressed, but he also didn't look bored. For him, that was something. Just as she began to find rhythm, the door opened and a group of customers walked in. Their laughter filled the room as they waited to be seated. One of them looked at Lena, then at Calder, and smirked. "Since when do you make your staff perform?" The man joked. Calder shrugged. "Since today." The man laughed again, clearly entertained by the entire situation. Lena tried not to let the reaction affect her, but it did. She felt the old fear return, the fear of being mocked, of being treated like a sideshow. She pressed a wrong note, then another, and her hands froze. Her heartbeat thudded against her ribs. She could feel the failure closing in. Calder sighed again. "If you don't know how to play, you could have just said so." The words sliced through her. They weren't loud, but she heard them clearly. A couple of guests exchanged amused looks. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say she hadn't played in years. She wanted to explain that she used to train every day, that music had once meant everything to her. But her voice wouldn't come out. Silence wrapped around her like a cold blanket. Her fingers hovered above the keys, shaking. Then she felt something shift inside her. It was small like a spark flickering in a dark room. But it was enough. She remembered why she had loved music. Not for applause. Not for attention. Not to impress anyone. She loved it because it was the one thing that made her feel alive. The one thing that made sense when nothing else did. Her breath steadied. She ignored Calder. She ignored the guests. She ignored the laughter behind her. She placed both hands fully on the keys and took another breath. Her fingers moved. This time, the notes were different. Not hesitant. Not forced. They carried emotion. A quiet sadness. A gentle strength. A memory of the dreams she once had. A small reminder of who she used to be. The melody drifted across the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was sincere, honest, and even the people, who had been laughing before, slowly fell quiet. The man at the corner lowered his fork. The bartender leaned forward again. The couple by the window stopped talking. Calder's expression changed too. For the first time, he looked unsure. He hadn't expected this. Lena kept playing. Her hands moved more confidently now, each note flowing into the next with natural ease. The restaurant felt different, softer, calmer. She didn't think about impressing anyone. She didn't think about her job. She didn't think about the mistakes she almost made. She just played. The melody deepened as she continued, her fingers warming to the keys like they had been waiting all this time. Her emotions poured through each note, her struggles, her exhaustion, her forgotten passion, her quiet hope. Some guests leaned back in their seats, listening. Others watched in silence. Calder's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, but in confusion. He had wanted entertainment, not emotion. He had expected a clumsy attempt, a joke to laugh at. He hadn't expected her to hold the room's attention. After a few minutes, her melody softened into its final notes. They lingered gently in the air before fading away. Lena kept her hands on the keys for a moment, letting the silence settle. She didn't move until she felt she could breathe again. When she finally lifted her hands, the room stayed quiet. No laughter. No whispers. Just silence. She stood slowly, unsure of what the response would be. She didn't expect applause. She didn't expect gratitude. She only hoped she had done enough not to face Calder's anger. He stepped forward, studying her with a strange look, part surprise, part disbelief. That wasn't terrible, he said quietly. It wasn't a compliment. But it wasn't an insult either. For him, that meant something. Lena lowered her eyes and nodded. Thank you, sir. Get back to work, he said, though his tone was softer than before. She stepped away from the piano, her heart still heavy, but more steady than when she had sat down. She didn't know what the performance meant or what would happen next. She didn't know if Calder would bring it up later or forget about it. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she had touched a piece of her old life, and it had reminded her that something inside her hadn't fully disappeared. Not yet. Lena returned to her usual tasks after leaving the piano, but her heartbeat refused to settle. She moved between tables, refilled glasses, and collected empty plates, yet her mind was still sitting on that piano bench. The memory of the melody she had played kept replaying softly in her head, like a warm but distant echo. She didn't know how long the guests stayed silent after she played, because she had walked away too quickly. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see disappointment or judgment on anyone's face. She didn't want to catch Calder's expression again either, an expression she couldn't quite read. For the rest of the afternoon, she avoided that corner of the restaurant. She didn't trust herself to look at the piano again without feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. She feared that if she let herself feel it too deeply, memories from her past would swallow her whole. But even as she tried to push the moment away, small details kept catching her attention. A guest she had served earlier gave her a polite nod as she walked by, as if acknowledging what she had done. Another guest smiled at her gently, something rare in a place where most people barely noticed the staff. Even the bartender, who usually kept to himself, gave her a quick look that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't cold either. She didn't know how to process any of it. She wasn't used to attention. She preferred staying invisible, safe. UNBOTHERED. As the hours passed, the restaurant grew busier. The early evening crowd filled the tables, and soft conversations blended with clinking plates and the hum of air conditioning. Lena focused entirely on her work, grateful for the distraction, but she couldn't deny that something inside her had shifted. There had been a tiny spark, but it was enough to keep her thinking, enough to stir something she thought she had buried. When her shift ended, she walked home quietly, her bag slung over her shoulder. The city lights shimmered around her as she made her way through familiar streets. She kept her steps slow, letting the cool evening air calm her nerves. She didn't want to think about tomorrow. She didn't want to guess whether Calder would expect her to play again. She didn't want to imagine what other guests might say, But one thought continued slipping into her mind, no matter how hard she pushed it away. Asterisk, what if she hadn't stopped playing years ago? Asterisk, the thought hurt more than she expected. She shook it off, telling herself it didn't matter now. Life had already chosen its path for her. Dreams didn't pay bills. Melodies didn't buy medicine. Reality didn't care about passion. When she reached the small apartment she shared with her mother, she unlocked the door quietly. The light from the living room spilled out into the hallway. "Is that you?" Her mother called softly. "Yes," Lena said, forcing her voice to sound steady. "I'm back. How was work?" She hesitated. "Busy." Her mother nodded and didn't ask anything more. She never pushed Lena for details. She knew her daughter worked hard. Too hard sometimes. That night, as Lena lay in bed, she closed her eyes and saw the piano keys again. She heard the melody she had played. She felt the room's silence. She felt the moment she had almost broken and the moment she had fought through it. She wasn't sure if she should feel proud or scared. Maybe both. The next morning came faster than she wanted. She dragged herself out of bed, got ready for work, and tried to mentally prepare for whatever the day would bring. When she arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere felt different, not tense, but not normal either. A few coworkers glanced at her with curious expressions. One of them, a waitress named Laura, approached her quietly. "I heard you played yesterday," she said, adjusting the tray in her hands. Lena froze. "Who told you?" "Everyone," Laura whispered with a small smile. "Word travels fast here." Lena didn't know how to respond. It wasn't really anything. That's not what people are saying. Before Lena could ask more, Laura was called to another table and hurried off. Lena's stomach twisted. She didn't want rumors. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to do her job quietly. She didn't have much time to think, though, because Calder walked in shortly after. As always, he scanned the room with quick, decisive eyes, making sure everything was in order. When his gaze landed on her, he paused. She felt her breath catch. But instead of approaching her right away, he simply nodded once, almost like an acknowledgement, before continuing his usual inspection. The nod startled her more than anger would have. She didn't know what it meant. Approval? Recognition? Or something else entirely? As she moved between tables, she felt Calder's presence more than usual. He wasn't watching her constantly, but he was aware of her, which made her overly cautious with every movement. She didn't want to make a mistake on a day when eyes seemed to be following her more than usual. During her break, she slipped into the small staff room at the back. She sat on the chair, trying to collect herself. She told herself she would avoid the piano for the rest of the day. Even if she felt its presence in the corner like a shadow, she couldn't escape. But fate had a strange way of ignoring the plans she made. When she returned to the floor, she had barely taken 5 steps when she heard a familiar sound, the sound of someone tapping the piano keys. Not playing, just tapping. Her heart lurched. She looked toward the corner and froze. Calder was standing next to the piano, speaking with a small group of guests who were pointing at it. They seemed amused, asking questions. Calder gestured casually, then turned his eyes toward her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that moment, she knew. She could feel it. He was going to make her play again. Her pulse quickened. Her hands grew cold. She tried to slip away to another section of the restaurant, hoping someone else would catch his attention. But Calder called her name. Not loudly, but firmly enough that she couldn't pretend not to hear. She walked toward him slowly, each step filled with dread. "Yes, sir?" she said softly when she reached him. "Come here," he said, motioning to the piano. "These guests want to know if we have entertainment planned for today." Lena felt her breath tighten. I'm not really supposed to. You played yesterday," one of the guests said with a friendly smile. He told us. Calder raised a brow as if daring her to challenge him. She looked between the guests and her boss. She could feel pressure building around her again, but this time it felt heavier, because now there were expectations. Yesterday, people thought she would fail. Now people thought she could do something worth listening to, and she wasn't sure which was scarier. I really should get back to work, she tried again. I'll tell you when to get back to work, Calder said calmly. Play something. Her heart dropped. She knew she couldn't refuse. Not without consequences. Not without risking her job. She needed this job, desperately. So she forced herself to take a seat at the piano once again. She hated how shaky her hands felt. She hated how many people were watching, even before she touched the keys. Yesterday had been hard enough. Today felt impossible. She placed her fingers on the keys and hesitated. She didn't know what to play. She had used the simplest melody she remembered yesterday, and even that had almost broken her. She didn't have anything else prepared. She didn't know if she was ready for this again. Any time now, Calder said, tapping the piano lightly. She closed her eyes, searching for anything that felt familiar. A tune from childhood. A lesson from years ago. Something simple. Something safe. But instead of a gentle melody, a memory flashed in her mind. Her mother sitting beside her, listening to her play a piece she had practiced for months. A piece she had performed in a small recital hall filled with strangers who clapped for her when she finished. That melody was harder, more emotional, more complicated. But it was still inside her. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She knew it would expose something raw inside her if she played it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she needed to remember who she used to be. Not for Calder, not for the guests, but for herself. She took a breath and began to play. The opening notes were soft but full of depth. Not hesitant this time, just gentle. The room quieted slowly, conversations fading as people turned to listen. Even guests who hadn't noticed her earlier began paying attention. The melody grew warmer, richer. Her hands moved with more confidence than yesterday, though she still felt nervous inside. The piece carried emotion, hope, sadness, longing, and the room absorbed all of it. The guests near the piano leaned in slightly, captured by the sound. The group Calder had been speaking to looked surprised. Even impressed. Calder himself took a slow step back, watching her more carefully now. Not amused. Not smirking. Just observing. Lena felt her nerves loosen just a bit. The music guided her again, shaping her emotions into sound. She didn't look up. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. She didn't want to. She wanted to stay in this small space where only she and the piano existed. When she reached the middle part of the piece, her fingers moved faster, gliding through familiar patterns. She could feel the emotion rising, reminding her of the girl she used to be, the girl who dreamed of playing in grand halls, the girl who believed she could make something of her music. Slowly, the melody softened again, drifting into a gentle ending. The final notes settled quietly in the room, like dust floating in sunlight. When her fingers lifted from the keys. The restaurant was silent, once more. This silence felt different from yesterday's. Yesterday's silence felt heavy with surprise. Today's felt heavy with respect. Lena kept her eyes on the keys. She didn't want to look up. She didn't want to see what the expressions around her meant. Finally, someone clapped. A single clap at first, then another. Then the entire group near the piano joined in, followed by guests across the room. It wasn't wild applause, but it was sincere, warm, and steady. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with emotion. She didn't know how to hold. Calder didn't clap, but his expression had changed again. Something thoughtful lingered in his eyes. Something she didn't know how to read. That'll do, he said softly when the applause faded. "You can get back to work now." It wasn't praise. It wasn't criticism. But it carried something she couldn't quite place. She stood slowly, her legs trembling slightly, and nodded. "Yes, sir." As she walked away, she felt the room's eyes follow her with a very different kind of attention. Not mocking, not amused, but curious. And for the first time, she wondered what this moment might lead to, and whether the life she had forced herself to forget was slowly finding its way back to her. The moment she placed her fingers on the keys, the entire room shifted. It was so small at first that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but anyone who had been watching her closely could feel the air around her tighten, like the space itself was holding its breath. Lena didn't start playing right away. She just sat there, shoulders slightly tense, eyes lowered, trying to gather the courage. She needed to do something she had been avoiding for a long time. The restaurant had gone quieter than usual, though soft murmurs still floated from tables that didn't take her seriously. Some people still believed she was going to tap a few random notes and walk away in embarrassment. Others expected a joke, a clumsy attempt that would give them something to laugh about. But there were also a few who had seen the look in her eyes earlier and felt something different, like she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone standing on the edge of an old world she once belonged to. The billionaire, standing a few steps away, watched her with an expression that mixed amusement and impatience. He didn't expect anything surprising. In his mind, she was simply a worker who needed to be reminded of her place. To him, forcing her to perform in front of wealthy guests was almost entertaining. He believed it would prove a point. And yet, some small part inside him felt a strange pull, a quiet curiosity he didn't want to acknowledge. Lena took one long breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the smooth, cool keys. Memories she had worked hard to bury rushed back years of practice in a small room. Her mother quietly listening in the kitchen. Her teacher guiding her with kind eyes. Concerts she never got to play. Dreams she had to abandon. She blinked slowly. Then she pressed the first note dot. It was soft. Almost too soft. A simple touch that barely seemed to fill the space. But it carried something inside it that spread slowly, almost like a drop of color entering clear water. It expanded gently, traveling between tables, weaving through conversations, slipping past the clinking of glasses. People looked up. The next note came, then another, and then her hands began to move in a gentle pattern that felt as natural to her as breathing. The melody wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was full of emotion, full of the story, full of years that she had locked away. Her posture changed as she continued. Her shoulders loosened, her breathing steadied, and the hesitation that had held her back began to fade. One of the guests at a nearby table leaned forward, fork frozen midway to his mouth. A couple who had been arguing minutes before stopped, both sets of eyes turning toward the piano. A young server peeked from behind the corner, his eyes widening little by little. Even the billionaire straightened slightly, though he tried his best to keep his expression neutral. Lena's hands flowed over the keys, each movement gentle but confident. The sound carried warmth, sadness, strength, and peace. It was a melody with no words, yet it seemed to speak to every person in the room. It whispered memories, touched old wounds, and quieted restless hearts. The restaurant fell quieter with each passing second. Conversations died down. Chairs stopped moving. The sound of plates being set on tables faded. People who had looked away turned back. Something about her playing pulled them in, a force that wrapped around them without asking permission. Lena didn't look at anyone. Her world had shrunk to the keys beneath her fingers and the music rising from them. She played like she was releasing something she had held inside for too long. Some notes sounded tender, others carried a hint of longing. But they all came from a place deep inside her, as she rarely allowed herself to visit. Middle-aged woman sitting near the back felt her eyes sting with tears she didn't understand. A young man who had been busy taking pictures of his meal set his phone down slowly, forgetting about the perfect shot he wanted. A group of business people, who moments earlier had been discussing deals and numbers, sat silently, caught in the gentle spell. Even the billionaire, who had started this whole moment, expecting to be amused, felt something in his chest tighten. He watched her more intently now, puzzled by the feeling growing inside him. He didn't want to admit it, but he was moved. Truly moved. Lena's fingers danced, building the music into something brighter, more hopeful. It wasn't loud, but it had a strength that filled every corner of the room. The soft lights above the piano reflected off her hair, making her seem almost like she belonged on a stage instead of behind trays and orders. Her eyes stayed closed for a few moments as she played a delicate run of notes. She wasn't performing for the audience. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just letting herself be, letting her heart speak the only way it knew how. People leaned closer without meaning to. The entire room was caught in a gentle silence, the kind that feels peaceful instead of empty. The melody flowed like a quiet river, touching everyone differently. The billionaire's guests exchanged glances, some of them surprised, others ashamed for having doubted her. One of them whispered something under his breath, but even whispers felt too loud in that moment. Lena shifted into another part of the melody, something slightly deeper, carrying a shade of sorrow that made the room feel even stiller. It was the kind of sadness that didn't ask for sympathy. It simply existed, soft, honest, and human. A young girl sitting with her family moved closer to her mother and whispered, "She plays like she's telling a story." Her mother nodded, though she had tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. The music grew and softened, rose and fell, with a grace that only someone who had lived through real struggles could bring into a song. Lena was no longer a waitress in that moment. She was a musician who had survived life, who had loved, lost, hoped, and fought quietly. And the room felt all of it by now. Not a single person was eating. No one was on their phone. No one was distracted. The entire restaurant, from the oldest guest to the newest server, had been caught inside the world she created with her notes. Even the staff behind the counter stopped moving for a moment. A cook, who rarely showed emotion, stood with his arms crossed, watching with gentle eyes. A hostess paused mid-step, holding a menu against her chest as she listened. The billionaire kept his arms folded, but his posture had changed. His eyes were softer, though he wouldn't show it openly. The smug satisfaction he had earlier was gone. Instead, he felt something he hadn't expected at all, a quiet regret, mixed with admiration he wasn't ready to admit. Lena continued playing, her hands steady and graceful. Every so often she would lift her head slightly, though her eyes stayed closed, as if she could feel the room breathing with her. The melody shifted one more time, turning warmer, brighter, almost like a promise that followed after hardship. Her body relaxed completely as she reached the last few notes. They came slowly, each one spaced out enough to let the room absorb them fully. When the final note arrived, it lingered gently in the air, carrying all the emotion she had poured into it. She held her hands above the keys for a moment before lowering them to her lap. Her chest rose and fell as she took a soft breath, the silence around her feeling almost unreal. The room stayed quiet. No one reacted right away. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy. It felt sacred. Everyone seemed afraid to break it. Lena kept her eyes down, afraid to look up and see judgment or pity. She didn't know what the reaction would be. She only knew that she had given everything she had to that moment. Then slowly, the silence began to shift. People looked at one another, unsure of what to do. A woman placed her hand over her heart. A man wiped at the corner of his eye. The young girl smiled softly, and in that breathless pause, the billionaire felt something inside him sink, a realization that he hadn't forced a timid waitress to play. He had pushed a true artist to open a part of herself that the world should never have been allowed to ignore. Before anyone clapped, before anyone stood, before the room burst into emotion, Lena sat there quietly, unaware that she had just silenced an entire room with a single song. When the final note faded, the restaurant felt as if it were holding its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The music still floated in the air, even though her hands had stopped, as if the melody had settled itself gently into the walls, the tables, and the hearts of the people listening. Lena kept her gaze low, unsure of what she had just done. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She had only wanted to escape the humiliation, to find something familiar that could keep her steady. She never imagined she would silence an entire room. The guests looked at one another, some with wide eyes, others with softened expressions, all trying to understand the feeling that had washed over them. It had been so unexpected. A simple waitress, ordered to play as a form of mockery, had turned the moment into something unforgettable. A woman sitting near the front wiped away tears she hadn't realized had fallen. A man who had walked in with a stiff, serious face now sat with his hand resting over his chest as if the music had reached somewhere he didn't show to anyone for a long moment. No one dared to break the silence, afraid to disturb the fragile beauty left behind by her playing. Even the workers behind the counter stood frozen. The cook, who usually moved quickly from station to station, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed loosely, looking at Lena with a kind of quiet respect. One of the servers had pressed her hands together, almost like she was praying. The billionaire stood in the same spot, though his expression had changed completely. The confidence he carried earlier had faded. What replaced it wasn't easy to name. He felt a mix of disbelief, admiration, and something he didn't want to admit aloud: guilt. He had forced her to play, expecting a performance he could laugh at or use to teach her a lesson. Instead, he had seen a truth he wasn't prepared for. Finally, someone in the audience took a deep breath, the sound softly breaking through the stillness. Then, as if the room collectively woke up, people began to move. A few stood to their feet. Some clapped gently at first, unsure if applause was enough for what they had just experienced. Slowly, the sound grew louder, richer, filling the restaurant with appreciation. Lena finally looked up, startled by the sudden applause. Her cheeks warmed, and she didn't know where to look. She had imagined many reactions: confusion, maybe laughter, maybe indifference, but not this. Definitely not this. A couple near the piano gave her a warm smile. A man held up a thumb in encouragement. A family seated at the far end nodded toward her in admiration. She stood from the piano bench slowly, giving a small, awkward bow. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief and emotion that rushed through her. She didn't play to impress them. She played because she had no other choice. The music had been a part of her for as long as she could remember, and letting it out felt like opening a window in a locked room. As the applause softened, people began whispering excitedly among themselves. Who is she? How does a waitress play like that? That didn't feel like a simple performance. That felt like something deeper. The billionaire approached her, though he moved more slowly than before. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by something gentler. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He stood there, unsure of how to begin, unsure of what he should even say. The guests watched with interest, sensing that something important was about to happen. Lena waited quietly, unsure if she was in trouble or being praised. Her hands folded in front of her, and she tried her best to maintain a calm expression, even though her heart still raced. Finally, the billionaire cleared his throat. I didn't expect that, he said softly, unable to maintain his usual commanding tone. She nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, though his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. She hesitated, glancing briefly at the guest still looking her way. Her eyes softened as memories rose. "I learned when I was younger," she said, keeping her voice steady. "It was something I used to love. But life doesn't always go how you plan. I had to stop." The billionaire listened without interrupting, something unusual for him. He opened his mouth to speak, but paused. He looked around the room, the guests still whispering, the staff still stunned. This was no ordinary talent. This wasn't something people stumbled into by accident. He took a step back, giving her space. "That song, it wasn't just music. It felt like you were telling a story." She lowered her eyes again, unsure how much she should reveal. "Maybe I was," she admitted quietly. A woman from the crowd approached with a smile. "That was beautiful," she said. "I felt like the whole room changed for a moment." Lena thanked her in a soft voice. Others soon followed, offering gentle words of admiration. Some told her how the music reminded them of old memories they hadn't thought of in years. A young couple said her playing made them feel peaceful. It was as if she had reached into each person's heart and stirred something alive. The billionaire watched all this with a conflicted expression. On one hand, he felt proud his restaurant had just witnessed something extraordinary. On the other hand, he realized that his own behavior had been unnecessarily harsh. He had pushed her to the piano for selfish reasons, yet she had turned the moment into something no one would forget. He stepped closer again. "Lena," he said, softer than before, "would you consider playing here more often? Not as a waitress. As the pianist, if you'd like. It would be an honor." Her eyes widened in surprise. She had not expected an offer. She looked around the room, seeing the hopeful expressions of the guests and the gentle smiles from the staff. Her heart fluttered with emotion. Playing music had always been her dream, but it felt too far away, too impossible, buried under responsibilities and reality. I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't played in front of people for a very long time, and I'm still working here to support my family." "Then I can make it easier for you," the billionaire replied. "Better hours, better pay. You won't have to give up anything. I just want you to share this gift. This restaurant needs it." His sincerity surprised her. She nodded slowly, still unsure, but not completely closed off. "Let me think about it." He smiled, truly smiled, for the first time that night. "Of course, take all the time you need." As the crowd slowly returned to their tables, some still looking her way, Lena took a seat on the edge of the piano bench. Her hands rested on her lap, still warm from playing. She felt something inside her shift, a small spark she thought she had lost forever. The staff gathered near her, offering soft congratulations. One of the servers grinned. "I knew you had something special in you." She laughed lightly. "I didn't know I still had it myself." The cook, usually quiet, nodded approvingly. That was real. Not just talent. Heart. His words touched her. She looked around at the people who had supported her quietly throughout the evening. Their kindness made her feel less alone, less burdened by the weight she had been carrying for so long. As the dinner service slowly resumed, the restaurant remained unusually calm. Conversations were softer, more thoughtful. People kept glancing at the piano, as if expecting it to come alive again. The melody lingered in their minds, and the emotional warmth it carried stayed with them. Lena stood and walked to the back room to take a break. The moment she stepped inside, she leaned against the wall, letting out a deep breath she had been holding. Her legs felt weak, and her heart was still beating too fast. But she felt something she hadn't felt in years' lightness. She closed her eyes, replaying the notes in her mind. Her mother's face flashed before her, smiling the way she always did when Lena practiced. She remembered the old piano at home, scratched and worn, but precious. She remembered the evenings when the house filled with music instead of quiet worry. The memories brought a soft ache to her chest, but for the first time in a long while, the ache wasn't painful. It was comforting. After a few minutes, she returned to the dining area. The billionaire caught sight of her and nodded, a silent gesture of respect. She nodded back, surprised that she felt no fear or resentment at that moment. Before she could go back to work, a small group of guests approached her with gentle smiles. "Thank you for sharing your gift," one of them said. "You reminded us of what real music feels like," another added. Their sincerity made her smile. "Thank you for listening," she replied softly. As the night continued, the atmosphere in the restaurant felt different. Warmer, more connected. The music had softened everyone, even those who tried to hide their emotions. People laughed a little more softly, spoke more kindly, and treated the staff with more respect. Near closing time, the billionaire approached her one last time. "If you decide to take the offer," he said, "you won't regret it. But even if you don't, I want you to know that what you did tonight, it was extraordinary." She nodded, grateful for the honesty in his voice. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." As the restaurant lights dimmed and the last guests left, Lena stood by the piano one more time. She touched the keys gently, letting her fingers rest there. A soft smile grew on her lips. For the first time in years, she felt like she had found a piece of herself again. And the room, still quiet, still holding the memory of her song, felt like it was waiting for her to return. The morning arrived slowly, with a soft light entering through the thin curtains. It was the kind of morning that felt calm on the surface, but carried a quiet tension underneath, as if everyone in the house could sense that something important was about to happen. The air was cool, and the silence was deeper than usual, broken only by the distant sounds of a few early birds. He woke up earlier than normal, not because of an alarm, but because his mind had been awake long before his eyes opened. For a moment, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the memories of the previous day replay in his head. There had been so many questions, so many unexpected emotions, and still no clear answers. But today felt different. Today, something needed to move forward. He finally got up, washed his face, and looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes looked tired, but there was a firmness in them too, a quiet decision forming inside him. He didn't know exactly how the day would unfold, but he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. Something inside him was pushing him to speak up, to clear the air, to bring some light into the confusion that had wrapped around everyone. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard soft footsteps coming from the kitchen. The smell of tea floated through the air, warm and comforting. When he entered the room, he found her already awake, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup. She looked up when she heard him, as if she had been waiting. Neither of them spoke at first. Their eyes met, and in that moment, both understood that the silence between them could not continue forever. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit," she said quietly. He nodded and took the seat. For a few seconds, the only sound was the gentle clinking of the cup against the saucer as she placed it down. "You didn't sleep well," she said softly. He gave a small, tired smile. "Neither did you." She didn't deny it. Instead, she took a slow breath and looked out of the window for a moment before turning back to him. "You want to talk, don't you?" she asked. "Yes," he replied honestly. "But only if you're ready." She shook her head gently. "Ready or not, some things need to be said." He felt his heartbeat pick up a little, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't want to create trouble for you. I don't want to make life harder. But I also don't want misunderstandings to grow." She listened quietly, Her eyes focused on him as if every word mattered. "You've been carrying a lot inside you," she said softly. "I can see that." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "I didn't want to burden anyone." "You're not a burden," she said immediately. Her voice was warm, sincere. "Sometimes we're afraid to open up because we think we'll trouble others. But keeping everything inside hurts even more." He looked up again, surprised by the gentleness of her words. There was no judgment, only understanding. "Yesterday," she continued, "you looked like you wanted to say something, but stopped yourself." He nodded slowly. "I was scared it would change things." She leaned slightly closer. "Things already changed, didn't they?" He didn't know how to answer that. Things had changed in ways he was still struggling to understand. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "Tell me what's on your heart." It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like a door opening. He took a deep breath. "I didn't expect to care this much. I didn't plan it. It just happened. And I didn't know what to do with it." She didn't move, didn't look away. Her eyes softened, but she waited for him to continue. "Every time you worry, I feel it. Every time you smile, it changes my whole day. You don't realize how much your presence affects me," he said, his voice low but steady. She swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "You're not the only one who feels things." His heart skipped for a moment. "I try to stay calm," she added, "because I don't want to make things complicated. But it's not easy for me either." He stared at her, unable to hide the surprise and relief passing through him. "Then why do you keep pulling away?" he asked gently. She looked down at her hands. "Because caring too much scares me. Because every time I let someone close, life finds a way to test me. And I don't want to lose control of my heart again." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. "I'm not here to rush you. And I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want honesty between us." Finally, she looked up again, and her eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You deserve honesty," she said. "And I'll try. But you need to be patient with me." "I can do that," he replied softly. A small smile appeared on her lips. Gentle but real. The tension in the room eased a little. It was not a dramatic moment, but it was a meaningful one. The kind of moment that quietly shifts the future. After a few minutes, she stood up and began preparing breakfast, and he helped without needing to be asked. They moved around the kitchen in a quiet rhythm, familiar and steady. There was a calmness between them, a sense that the walls they had built were finally starting to lower. Later in the day, the house grew more active. Voices filled the rooms, footsteps echoed, and the usual responsibilities returned. But something had changed between them. Their eyes met more often. Their conversations flowed more naturally, and even the silences felt comfortable instead of heavy. In the afternoon, they stood outside near the garden. The sunlight was warm, touching everything with a golden glow. The flowers were moving gently with the breeze, and the leaves were whispering softly. She looked at him and said, "You know, it's been a long time since I felt safe opening up to someone." He turned toward her. "Then I'm glad you trusted me even a little." She smiled lightly. "A little can grow if we handle it with care." He nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. They walked slowly through the garden, not in a hurry, just letting the moment stretch comfortably. She told him stories from her childhood, moments she'd never shared before. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions, laughing softly at the small details she added. She talked more freely than usual, and he could see how much she had kept locked inside. At one point, she stopped walking and glanced at him. "You know, when I first met you, I didn't think you'd ever become this important to me." He smiled. "I thought the same. Life has strange ways." "Very strange," she agreed, her eyes shining with a warmth he had not seen in her before. The day passed gently, without any big drama, but every hour felt meaningful. Sometimes life doesn't change with loud moments. Sometimes it changes quietly, through soft conversations, shared silences, and the courage to speak honestly. In the evening, as the sky turned orange and purple, they sat outside again. The world felt still, as if giving them space. "Thank you for today," she said. "For what?" He asked. "For listening. For being kind. For not giving up even when I made things difficult." He shook his head softly. "I'm here because I want to be. You don't have to thank me for that." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Some people stay only until things get heavy. But you stayed even when you didn't have to." "Maybe that's because you matter more than you think," he replied. Her expression softened, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection that didn't need big words. As the night settled in, the lights inside the house glowed warmly. She stood up first. "Come inside," she said gently. "It's getting cold." They walked toward the house slowly, side by side. There was no rush, no pressure, just a comfortable closeness. Before they stepped inside, she stopped and looked at him again. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said. "That's enough for me," he replied, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled with her whole heart. The day had begun with uncertainty, but it ended with hope, quiet, steady, and real.